Okay, so we're going to go ahead and begin. Let me introduce the Associate Director of the Institute for Ethnic Studies, Dr. James Garza, who will say a little words about the Institute, and then I will introduce our panel.
All right, good evening, everybody. James Garza, I'm the Associate Director for the Institute for Ethnic Studies. The Institute for Ethnic Studies was founded in 1972 here at UNL. Today, we include 17 joint appointed faculty members from 6 academic departments, together with over 30 affiliated faculty members from across the university. We offer graduate specializations in ethnic studies at the MA and PhD levels, undergraduate, majors in ethnic studies and Latin American studies, and undergraduate minors in ethnic studies, African American studies, US Latina studies, Latin American studies, and Native American studies. So our courses reach over 3,000 UNL students every academic year. So welcome to Black Lives Matter.
Thank you, James. So for those who don't know me, my name is Jeannette Eileen Jones. I'm an Associate Professor of History and Ethnic Studies here at the university, and I'm part of the African American and African Studies program. I'm also a program faculty in Women and Gender Studies. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists who will talk in the order in which I introduce them. Well, first, we're going to start with Dr. Kwkiutl Dreher. She's Associate Professor of English and Ethnic Studies, and she's also the Program Liaison for African American and African Studies here at UNL. She conducts research in African American literature, autobiography, film, visual and popular culture, and mass-marketed popular literature. This past summer, she was the Senior Faculty Fellow for the African American Studies program at the University of South Carolina. She has published Dancing on the White Page, Black Women Entertainers Writing Autobiography with SUNY Press. Dr. Dreher is an actor, a playwright. She has authored a one-woman show, In a Smoke-Filled Room, Color Matters, and was a Play Lab selection, at the Great Plains Theater Festival in 2003, which was held in Omaha, Nebraska. It debuted in Lincoln at the Haymarket Theater in January 2014. That's Dr. Dreher. Dr. Gregory E. Rutledge is Associate Professor of English and Ethnic Studies. He specializes in African American literature and culture with a keen interest in racialized epic performance within the diaspora. This interest stems from his native son Floridian status, studies in Afro-American culture, and experience as a law student and lawyer. There's a lot of hats. His race, law, and literature class is the culmination of these experiences. Currently, along with his specialty and interest in speculative fiction, his major research interest is in Afro-Korean connections, a project that recently took him to South Korea for 2 years and earned him a Fulbright Award. His wife, a Korean scholar, is his collaborator. He has often been engaged in community activism. For example, he was a co-organizer of Hurricane Katrina's fundraisers as a new faculty member here at UNL in 2005, and then later in 2006. He volunteered with the Harambe African Cultural Organization with Black inmates in the Nebraska State Penitentiary starting in 2006. He worked with Habitat for Humanity, was a legal aid volunteer for the Atlanta Project started by President Jimmy Carter, and was a reading tutor at Project Spirit of Ebenezer Baptist Church. He has a long list of other activities, including Stand for Children, which was a rally in Atlanta in the mid-90s, and also was a member of the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. He has published a monograph on epic performance and race, law review articles, literary criticism, book reviews, essays, poetry, and fiction, always with the world as we inhabit it in his mind. Thank you. Professor Kwame Dawes is the author of 19 books of poetry and numerous other books of fiction, criticism, and essays. He has edited over 1,000, excuse me, did I say that? I think you write a lot, Kwame. He has edited over a dozen anthologies. excuse me. His most recent collection, City of Bones, was published by Northwestern University Press and will appear in 2016, along with a co-written collection of verse with Australian poet John Kinsella. He also will publish an anthology of poetry celebrating the work of Romar Bearden, which he edited with Matthew Shinoda, and a trilingual anthology of Haitian poetry written after the recent earthquake, which he also edited. A collection of his poems titled Vuelo in Spanish will appear in 2016, as well as in Mexico and Spain. He is currently the Glenna Lushai editor of Prairie Schooner and teaches at the University of Nebraska here and the Pacific MFA program. He is director of the African Poetry Book Fund and artistic director of Calabash International Literary Festival. Last but not least is Dr. Michael Combs. He is professor of political science here at UNL. His research areas include judicial politics and constitutional law, African American politics, and urban politics. His current research includes the participation of the Supreme Court in the conceptualization of race and the construction of the paradox of American apartheid, as well as how the American cultural, historical values and beliefs impact the Supreme Court's frame on racial issues and questions. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Chancellor's Fulfilling the Dream Award in 2001. That same year, the American Political Science Association gave him the award for Best Book on Urban Politics. He has received recognition awards from the UNL Parents Association for contributions to students, as well as the UNL Teaching Council in 92, 93, 95, 2001, 2, 3, 5, and 8. He has written a lot, but I'm going to highlight one book which I think is really relevant to some of the things we're going to talk about. He is a co-editor of Civil Liberties in the Constitution, Cases and Commentary, which was published in 2011. Dr. Combs recently organized the G.E. Hendricks Symposium, The Challenge of Inequality in the Age of Obama. Does Race Still Matter? He also organized last year's academic year's forum sponsored by the African American Leadership Council. That forum also addressed Black Lives Matter, police accountability, and African American relationship with the United States legal system. Dr. Combs.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for arranging this and conceptualizing this event. Thank you so very much. The title of my presentation is I Need Somewhere to Lay It Down. I need somewhere to lay it down because Black Lives Matter. I need somewhere to lay it down because since 2013, when George Zimmerman was found not guilty of manslaughter in the death of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, my heart has been traumatized by the subsequent slate of events involving Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Marlene Pinnock, or the Black woman beaten on the side of the road by a cop in California, or Natasha McKinney, who was restrained with handcuffs behind her back, legs, shackles, and a mask when a sheriff's deputy shot her 4 times. Even more recent, Sarah Lee Circle Bear, who has died in custody. But no other death, however, traumatized me as that of Sandra Bland. Ms. Bland was found hanging from a trash bag in her cell in Waller County, Texas, after having been pulled over by Officer Brian Encina for a minor traffic violation. Perhaps it was that my spirit had had enough. Perhaps Bland's case was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. I don't know. Maybe it was because of my father, Ulysses, who taught me how to ride a bicycle and taught me how to drive. That Dad taught me how to drive meant I had permission to ride the highways and byways and streets and roads. If It was my father who gave me my wings to fly, to stretch my boundaries. So here I was in my hometown this summer on fellowship at the University of South Carolina. The fellowship came at a most momentous time in South Carolina history and more broadly in the history of the United States. You see, 9 churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina had been killed at point blank by Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old Confederate enthusiast whom the members had welcomed in their midst during Bible study. That he was photographed waving a Confederate flag and burning the American flag led to the final dismantling of the Confederate flag at the State House in my hometown, Columbia, South Carolina. I viewed Senator Clemente Pinckney's body as it lay in state at the State House in South Carolina. He was the pastor at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, and one of the 9 murdered in Mother Emanuel. I also listened to those whites who were crying. No, they were sobbing over the dismantling of their beloved flag. I woke up to the news, Irene News climbed that pole and took the flag down and arrested when she descended for defacing monuments on the state capitol grounds. I interviewed Senator Strom Thurmond's granddaughter, Wanda Williams Bailey, on why she thought the Confederate flag should come down. I also interviewed House representatives and laypersons asking the same question. So I had mapped out my plans for research on a story I am writing set in my hometown of Columbia, South Carolina. Not only was I to spend time in the stacks at the Thomas Cooper Library at the University of South Carolina, I was to conduct primary research through interviews with members of my own community of Burton Heights and members who lived in other surrounding Black communities in Columbia. But my time was not to be set in Columbia only, no. I was to travel to Atlanta and conduct research at the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and spend time with Francine Henderson, the executive director of the library, now retired. Then off to tour again of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial and a visit to my alma mater, Clark Atlanta University. Then on July 13th, the Sandra Bland story broke and I was paralyzed. I could not move. I said to myself, they strung that girl up and they lynched her, and she was just 28 years old. That could have been me. Then came the videos of her talking about personal issues with living and her leanings towards suicide. Then the story of her refusing to put out her cigarette when asked by Officer Encina. Her broken jaw at the hands of that officer. Her mugshot signaled a most distraught young woman who had her life ahead of her. I was hysterical, and I had nowhere to lay it down. And I was not going to take my chances on I-26 going to Atlanta. When I approached my colleagues and friends, all I could get was, well, something was wrong with her, or all was not right with her anyway. And, she tried to kill herself one time, and maybe this was the last straw, or she was disturbed, and all of these tied up with past injustices. The civil rights movement was supposed to have taken care of this shit, I said to one of my high school teachers. To which she replied, I tried to tell you young people when I had you in class, it's never over. Too much has happened to us and to them. No, I wasn't going to Atlanta, and I did not go because I would not take my chances of being on that road alone, and maybe because I didn't have a turn signal on, I would be pulled over to the side. Where can I lay this down? My high school teacher's remarks pointed to me history and reminded me of my studies of Thomas Jefferson while in graduate school. His notes on the state of Virginia brought home for me the roots of my hysteria and from where I had pulled to instigate it. In his query called Manners, Jefferson notes, it is difficult to determine on the standard by which the manners of a nation may be tried, whether Catholic or particular. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people, produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous of passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. Now, I'm showing you these pictures of lynchings not to sensationalize anything, but to bring home for you what Jefferson is talking about. He rightly predicted this horror, this boisterous of passion that have been passed down to generation. This happened in Omaha, right down the street. But I want to call your attention to the way the people are leaning in to get their pictures, to get their faces into this picture. There is no fear of reprisal from the law, not at all. But they are definitely wanting to be a part of this boisterous, passionate moment here. Jefferson continues. The quality, this quality is a germ of all education in him. From his cradle to his grave, he is learning to do what he sees others do. If a parent could find no motive either in his philanthropy or his self-love for restraining the intemperance of passion towards his slave, it should always be sufficient, one, that his child is present. Now you look at this. You look at this. This is the body of a hanged, a lynched African-American male. You look at this little girl here who is looking on this vision with joy. Look at the father or the male who is standing, which is another generation. This boisterous passion has been passed down to this young woman here. This is what she is seeing. If you look at this picture here, the guy is leaning in, wanting to be a part of this. On the back of this postcard says, "This is the barbecue we went to." They took pictures of this and sent it to their relatives. This is what Jefferson predicted. This is a generation that is practicing this boisterous of passion here. It's an imitation of comes out of the root from slavery. And this is something we need to understand here. Jefferson continues, but generally, it is not sufficient. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose to his worst of passions, and thus nursed, educated, and what? Daily exercised in tyranny. But it is his query on the differences between the races that reverberated within me. Jefferson writes on these differences when considering the deportation of emancipated people back to Africa. The issue was taken up after the Revolutionary War. He says, it will probably be asked, why not retain? He's talking about integration. This is in the 18th century. It will probably be asked, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state, and thus save the expense of supplying, by importation of white settlers, the vacancies they will leave? He says this cannot happen. Why? Because there are deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites. 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into what? Parties, and produce convulsions, which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race. I began to lay it down. Why? Because finding root of these injustices reminds me of how racism is inculcated. Our president was right. These voices of passions, these imitations that children have seen their parents do have been passed down from generation to generation, and we are still dealing with it. Some of you will say today, well, I had nothing to do with that. I was not a slaveholder. I wasn't a slave. Why should I have anything to do? Why should I have to deal with this? Because we're talking about legacies, and it is biblical. The sins of the father will be visited upon the children if you are not careful. And this is what we have to deal with. The legacies that have been passed down from generation to generation that are still practiced by some people in our society today. Why did I begin to lay it down? Because I know, reminded, how man has imitated the most boisterous of passions through generations. I do not have all of the answers. No, I don't. But I do know that when we see that these events, issues, and dialogues, when we see these issues and dialogues just did not what? Poof! Out of the sky. They have a root. And they're being practiced. And we have to find an incentive for this root to be plucked and burst here. Perhaps once we know and we visit history, perhaps we can make steps towards some change, if not realization, of how we ended up here. Thank you for coming out tonight, because your presence gives witness to my story. And in your listening to my story, I have had the opportunity to lay it down. Thank you.
Good evening to you all. Good evening. Or maybe I should say, annyeonghaseyo. That's hello in South Korea. My talk is of Black Lives Matter, and it's a wordplay on Seoul and, of course, the capital of South Korea. Black Lives Matter has an uncanny feel for me. For it is as close as the racial norm in America that we just heard about from Dr. Dreher, and was as far away in time and space and culture and climate as South Korea, where I was when it exploded at Ferguson. So it takes some time getting used to. Or maybe I'm not supposed to. In our modern world, where possibly Barack Hussein Obama became president and won the election, a world full of wireless technology, biogenetics, organic foods, nanotechnology, Facebooks, hybrid cars, laser surgery, drone delivery, and drone death. You're not supposed to see 1950s and 1960s reruns. Civil rights gray, black power black, Bull Connor white, happening in audiophonic high-def color. You're not supposed to see and hear a North Charleston cop shooting pop, pop, pop into the back of a man running and then staggering away from him and collapsing into a heap. You're not supposed to see and hear a man pulled over for a broken taillight by University police get shot in the face. You're not supposed to see a woman pulled over for a lane change without signaling, get threatened, get arrested, and end up dead. A suicide, the official police report. A large man wrestles to the ground, gasping, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," until he could breathe no more. A boy in a park walking back and forth and brandishing a toy gun, shot in his stomach by police 2 or 3 seconds after their cruiser shoots into the black and white video. And then they leaked out. They tackled his sister to the ground, denied her right to aid him while they waited, agonizing seconds turning into fatal minutes to place a 911 call. Her brother bled to death. A Maryland man draped between the arms of two police in detention after he ran away for having committed no crime. Dead somehow in a police van of an impossibly broken neck. A young man, a recent high school graduate in Ferguson, shot dead for walking in the middle of a side road and left to dry up like a raisin in the sun. And then Bible study, an open sister and brotherhood, the mother of Emmanuel way, historically, warmly, godly, civilly, humanely, exploded in the orgy of violence in the park of Charleston. Does it fester like a sore and then run, or does it explode? I resort to poetry here because it's appropriate for suturing together contradictions, particularly the unreal, surreal, uncanny, unspeakable, horrific, the unflinchingly brutal, to the normal, the real, the everyday. The it, lowercase I, of Langston Hughes' famous poem, Harlem, also implies it, uppercase I, that is something monstrous, born amid patrolling the streets. Poetry also invokes the vast, ancient, faraway vistas of the imagination, of stories, of cultures, and of humanity. So here's my poetic conundrum. What is the meaning to be extracted from these and other so too many other police executions and inhumanities like this that allows for a modern black individual like me to have a point of entry, understanding, and redress? This question is figurative, since it advances a structural metaphor. The racial problem is a house, a building, a place. One must find a way to enter if you are to find answers. But it is also, and more importantly, literal. From my 2-year stay in Gimpo, South Korea, just outside of Seoul, the question of my point of re-entry became increasingly pressing. What the hell is going on in the US of A? What is it? When I left on a Fulbright Award in the thick humidity of a Lincoln summer on the 22nd of July 2013, for the Far East that was even more humid, little could I have known that just looking at the news, looking back toward the West, toward America, that things would get so far out. I then reflected often, as a soul brother just living outside of Seoul, on just how different things could be. Because I'm an educator and I have a son and I'm from Central Florida, and education is so central to Koreans because of their Confucian ideology, I couldn't help but reflect on how so many of the kids were coming back late at night from Hagwons. These are Korean academies that the kids go to all the time, beginning basically with daycare, and it's for English, it's for Chinese, it's for math, it's for sciences, and they're going all the time. They were coming back at 11 or 11:30 at night or later, without much worry for their personal safety. Guns are outlawed in South Korea. Or there were times when I'd be coming back from my in-laws. About 9 o'clock at night, and we would see children. 7 years old was my son. I'd see 7-year-old children, sometimes a little bit younger, dashing about in the dark. And I thought, well, where are your parents? They should have you at home. Now, with this in mind, in our son's performance of a version of Maurice Sendak's 1963 classic, Where the Wild Things Are, as part of our family school project, I sat down and wrote this poem on October 28, 2013. It's called By George, No Trayvons. It's haunting to see a reverse hoodie, not like Max in his wolf hoodie, sailing over a year, his white hoodie, sailing through a day, his hoodie no longer where the wild things are. Its tech-lit faces ghosting about, hooded by the night, innocent eyes hooded to dangerous zimmers. Boys hooded to guns, crazy for blood, and sisters hooded to final screeching goodbyes. By George, no Trayvons, just spooky faces, haunted by little odd books and fine pale fingers stenciling, and here's Korean, but it is Anyang, into either. This poem is not just about something as innocent as a child's hoodie, Trayvon's or Max's wolf suit hoodie, or about guns, or even about standing ground laws proliferating state by state, but about human culture. This interest in human culture as this interest in human culture is what took me to South Korea. I was there with my wife as project collaborator to research the intersection of African American and Korean culture, to find the common voice of humanity that always gets subordinated. Now this human core is policed and segregated. It is policed and segregated. Diversity and multiculturalism promoted ahead of our common human culture reinforces the divisions. None of this is surprising, for the rise of the university and canons and disciplines helps to segregate us. My 1 year Fulbright study became 2. It takes at least a year of living in a place to begin to feel the culture, see what lurks beneath the facade. And with a world-leading rate of cosmetic surgery being the face of modern South Korea, this is literally the case. I mean, there is cosmetic surgery there everywhere in South Korea. So my first reaction to being in South Korea was not unlike that of, I think, many of the African Americans beginning of the 19th century who went to France or went to Europe and then came back after some time there, after being expats. And so to me, it was the question of, well, what is this like? To not feel like so much black matter? To be celebrated as exceptional, even if by mistake or innocent joke? On my first trip to South Korea after I got married, there were kids who pointed out to me, hey, Michael Jordan. Most recently when I went back, it was on occasion, hey, Barack Obama. To not be judged by the ranking of race that is so essentially, most exceptionally American, to think I can get used to this, to being seen, to being human. Soul food, the Far East soul food, mind you, is splendid. It's still, notwithstanding the fast food invasion of McDonald's, Burger King, Pizza Hut, Domino's, and Starbucks, a fresh food culture with many full vegetables and spices. Yucatan, urichi, pindeli, kimchi, mukimchi, all this kind of great food there. I could get used to having it in an unlimited store of restaurants like this. And then all the drinks that they had. I did my fair amount of drinking there. You can't resist it. A public transportation system of buses swarming everywhere, but beware and hold on, traffic signals don't really govern bus drivers. And subways and outrageously inexpensive taxis. Run fast to get to the door and do not be civil, gentlemanly, for the public transportation is packed and you'll find little old how many's grandmothers or forceful ajumas, middle-aged women, who have no time for your mess, roaring past you, giving you an NBA elbow, shoving you out of the way, and your kid too. But you must remember, there are no guns in South Korea. We had no car, so we know this well. The subway system is one of the best in the world, and this along with the high-speed KTX makes you wonder and think about people who say, that's a third world country. And I encounter that fairly frequently. But when you think about what happened with Hurricane Katrina, it's hard to reconcile that difference. Black Lives Matter emerged at this time for me there in South Korea. Near the end of this first year, I could say that I had encountered and studied a fair amount of Korea as a member of a Korean family. I am a student of the language. I was becoming Korean as son-in-law, Sawi, or as uncle, Gomobu. As ambivalent as I was about some aspects of Korean culture, there were many wonderful things. But this talk is about human culture, what I said earlier, about 2 years working here. My second year began, literally, with a rather sharp unveiling. After a brief return to the United States in August of 2014, I came back to see family, take care of some administrative affairs. We were picked up from the Incheon International Airport by a couple of family members. And one of the questions they first asked us when we got in the car was, were you screened? And this was at the time when Ebola was raging. And this question from our family members was something that was really quite striking. Now, was it because we were American? Was it because of me? I don't know the answer to this question, but this signaled the emergence of the conundrum about re-entry. In a way, it all comes together for me in East Asia, for it is a vested locus of Cold War corporate soft power control that has been most cherished by the West since the 19th century. Literally after the Civil War, U.S. warships were in South Korea, trying to force open South Korea. In the 1890s and first years of the 20th century, right around the time of Plessy, around Jim Crow, around the Nader for African Americans with the lynchings, there were South Koreans being deported by the U.S. administration, going to San Francisco, going to Boston. Jazz was there in South Korea in the 1920s, coming from Japan, coming from China. Mind you, this is Paul Whiteman jazz, not. And this jazz is all the rage until it was banned in the 1930s by the Japanese, trying to fend off the cultural imperialism at work in its colonial holding. Too late, Pearl Harbor didn't work. The instability of Africa and its diaspora were keenly felt by me in a unique way there in South Korea. The Ebola outbreak reminds one of the centuries-old exploitation of Africa and sowing of instability by Western powers for its own profiteering. Black Lives Matter grew out of the U.S.'s centuries-old policy of attaching chattel object status to people of African descent and their cultures. In South Korea, I learned, received substantial U.S. governmental aid, logistics, and technology support in the period from the 1940s well into the 1970s and 1980s, as blue-collar jobs and government aid vanished from places like urban Detroit, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, and so on. In short, as U.S. aid left now burgeoning inner cities and went far, far east, as African-American textiles went overseas, South Korea moved forward toward its 1980s miracle. During the Ebola crisis, I traveled on buses and subways to and from Yonsei University, where I taught a race, law, and literature class at Underwood International College, and also Yonsei University, where I taught the first inaugural course in African American literature there. It is no exaggeration to say that during the months of September to December, there were many times in which I sat on buses and I saw South Koreans literally during the Ebola crisis veer away from me as I was seated. There were times, 2 or 3 times, when whole sections of my subway section were empty except for me. I wasn't invisible, but too visible. Not segregated, unseen, but quarantined by sight. I remember the Ebola hysteria in the US, how kids and adults were treated, and how slow in coming the international aid to West Africa was. Eventually things went back to normal there in South Korea, but that left me with a realization that I had over the years visiting South Korea. Its culture was less friendly, I felt, to blacks, had fewer black images on television, in public, as the country modernized. Hence, South Korean culture should be kept in mind as we consider whether Black Lives Matter will mean anything lasting. Hip-hop is everywhere in South Korea and gave Psy's Gangnam Style its beat, but you can hardly find images of black hip-hop performers anywhere in the mainstream. Travel in the buses and subways, most of which have TVs, and you'll find an overwhelming absence not only of black hip-hop figures, but black thinkers, creators, models, normal and decent people. Billboards and posters in grocery stores and malls are the same. There are 3, 4 Fox stations in South Korea. When you can find tennis, it's more often not a rerun of old Maria Sharapova matches. Seldom is Serena seen. Whiteness is the obsession of young men and women, a state all the more possible because, unlike the past, children from kindergarten to the senior years in college live under the fluorescent lamp. They're studying that much. So this is all about human culture, and if it is true, what I learned in May 2013 from Dr. James E. Walton, a now retired African American Studies literature professor, he said, the racism in Japan is not about Japanese people's deep-seated racism, but the business culture. He said that one of his friends, an academic, said that we don't even like having any dealing with the business people because they're so like that. Individually, they're fine, but the business ethos is detestable. And so when you think about this, you think about culture, Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street, as far as I'm concerned, really confronts this question of how are you going to deal with this question of culture? One of the critiques of the Occupy movement was that it was too diffuse, it didn't have any real goal, it didn't really have any purpose. And when you're dealing with questions of culture, and it's in the educational sector, it's in the business culture, it's in the legal culture, it is in the entertainment culture, it is in the schools, it's everywhere, then it's hard for it to be focused. It's impossible for it to be focused because if it's going to make real change, it's going to have to be here in Lincoln, it's going to have to be here in Nebraska, it's going to have to be in the Midwest, it's going to have to be in South Korea. Thank you.
I suspect that there is an anxiety abroad that the term Black Lives Matter has a corollary to it, which is the implication that other lives don't. Or you might be thinking, are these people who believe that their lives are more interesting than white lives? Maybe. You have to live with it. But here's what I wanted to talk about. Universities are very peculiar places. There's a weird thing about change in universities that is predicated on the extent to which the university manages to transcend the fundamental problem of change in universities, especially when that change is being driven by students. And it is the fundamental problem of 4 years. Because any wise administrator at a university knows that all they have to do is wait. And then all you rabble-rousers, all you black fist holders are going to graduate and are going to get out of here and may never come back. And if you come back, it'll be for homecoming, it'll be for the fun thing. You probably won't even ask what happened to your big struggle. You probably won't even ask whether anything has changed, because frankly, you were here for a reason and you left. So all they have to do is wait. And then a new bunch will come in and they will start all over again, and they will be excited and they'll be fired up and they will graduate. And then it'll be over. So any kind of institutional change that has to happen has to come through a coalition and a dynamic relationship between the folks who are stuck here and you who have the power to see things change. Here's the thing. Race in this university has to be pretty. Listen, there are only a few things that motivate anybody to see change along racial lines in this university, or any university for that matter. One of the most compelling things is to say there's a ton of them, right? There's so many people who are black, therefore you better do something about it. Or, do you know how many black people are in this state? We've got to do something to make this, this guy, and you go, well, it's not many. So what is the motivation for making this university a black place and so on? So the motivation for change has to come from a vision that understands that there's value in the idea of valuing the lives of people of color. And if there's one thing that should happen at a university, is to recognize the intellectual value of black lives, black minds. Very beautiful things, black minds. And they matter. But you see, part of the problem is that very often our only kind of perception and attitude to the problem of blackness is to help the black people. It's perceived as a kind of, if you, for instance, think of Africa. Africa, what a wonderful country Africa is. Like half of you didn't get it. Stop yourself, stop. Or take Africa, for instance. For many people, the only way you can conceive of a relationship between this university and Africa is on the basis of us helping them poor black people in Africa. You've got to be doing developmental. You've got to help the struggling folks who are poor. When you go there, you have to be there to give. And if you learn anything, it will be how great it is in America and how humble you are to have been able to serve. And this is the only way to imagine a relationship with a continent as grand and as varied and as fantastic and wonderful as Africa. But it's an embarrassment that the university carries that idea without recognizing that it can learn, it can engage in the intellectual, in the poetic, in the artistic, in all the other dimensions of African culture, in the sciences, that it can learn from them. Could you even imagine something like that? Because you see, here at this university, I'm having the hardest time convincing the university to take seriously an engagement with Africa that is on an equal basis, where the university learns something from Africa. It's tough to do that. If I talk about water and the need for water for poor people, they get that. They get that. If I talk about the healing of diseases, well, they get that. Because there's a perception of Africa as a place that needs and we give. Well, this is sick, this is wrong, this is stupid. Because what I bring to this place is incredible intellectual illumination. I'm bright. Yes. And there are more of me. So, Black Minds Matter. I'll start.